Hey everyone, how you doing? Today I'm going to talk to Adam Bradley about Partytown. You're probably wondering what Partytown is. It is a very interesting take on putting third-party libraries into a separate browser thread. What is Partytown?
So Partytown is a library that allows you to move your third-party scripts off of the main thread. So off of the main thread that you should be having all of your resources on, your app, your code, dedicated to just your code, basically. And then third-party scripts are onto a web worker, onto a different thread, basically not affecting the performance of your site. And that's the goal anyways.
Yeah, and third-party scripts has been a major issue for quite some time. Like you put a chat client on your site and then you're trying to figure out, okay, this chat client's like 2 megs, right? And it's going to mess up all of the statistics and analytics for your site and reduce customers, but you wanted that chat client there to improve the customer service experience. And so what you're saying is you could put that then in a web worker and it would load independently in a separate processing thread for your site.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's this double-edged sword where like businesses, websites, anyone that has a business online, they need to have these services. They need to have Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, Intercom, HubSpot. All of these different services make sense for the business to collect the data. But all of these services, each one comes with at least a 0.5 megabyte of code. You add 3 or 4 of them to your site, all of a sudden you got 2 megabytes of someone else's JavaScript running inside of the main thread of your application, slowing down your application. And so everyone loves third-party scripts. They have a great business purpose, but they also really slow down your site. And so that's the whole goal here, is that we want to still allow these services to run, but kind of more in the background in kind of a different process. And web workers have been a practical solution for doing, running long-running tasks inside of a different thread. The problem has always been, well, it doesn't have access to the DOM, it doesn't have access to the window, things like that. And really, that's kind of what Partytown is trying to solve here, is being able to give the web worker synchronous communication with the main thread, but in a different thread, if that makes any sense. So that's the goal anyways. There's still, it's still alpha, still not ready for production. We're actively testing it out in some of our own production sites right now. And we're even working with some of our partners to test it out on their production sites, specifically something like an analytic or an e-commerce site, where performance really does make a difference in, add to cart, things like that. And so we're trying to collect all the data we can right now so that in upcoming posts, we can definitely, show the differences of before and after.
Yeah, you harked on it just a little bit there. The problem with web workers is that 1, they're asynchronous from the main thread.
Yep.
And 2, they don't have access to the DOM. And both of those things make it really difficult to move a third-party library into a web worker. So now I'm really curious. I want to see what that looks like in code and then how I would use it. And then we can look at some of the source code after that.
Sure, yeah. So the biggest, basically it's a trick that we're using. And there's 2 ways that we've found that you can synchronously communicate between the 2 different threads. One is the service worker trick. And I'll be the first to admit that it's a complete hack, but it just works. It really allows it to work. And then the other way is through atomics. And I would think that's the more correct way. And that's also what we're working on right now. So the source code is built where there's kind of a generic code that just takes some sort of communication. So a lot of the code is in just how to send messages back and forth. And then there's going to be 2 different builds. One using the service worker trick, which is basically would work in all browsers, except for IE11. And then the other one would be for the atomics, where this is, it's in tech preview for Safari and it's enabled in Chrome today. But the other gotcha is that it needs to have certain HTTP headers to allow it to work. And so I see atomics as the correct future way to do it, but also it's not easy to implement for everyone. And then the fallback would be the service worker way. It does work for everyone. And then for the IE11 users, there's even like, if you don't support service workers, then just do it the normal way. Basically, just go back to how they always worked. So there's that fallback too.
Yeah, that's actually really nice that you can fall back to the regular way of loading it in the DOM for cases where it's not supporting the methods that you're trying to use. Also, I've never heard of atomics. What are atomics?
So atomics are extremely brand new, and I actually do not know enough to talk too smart about them yet. That's something I'm learning right now. But basically, it's a way to allow us to have the worker thread be blocking. Like we can say like, hey, hold up. I'm going to go get some information. We go get some information on the main thread. It sends it back and then it continues to go. Again, it's brand new. I need to learn a lot about it myself. What's awesome is community has already submitted some PRs and how it can work. I got a lot of great feedback in Twitter of how this is all going to work. And so right now, what's on another branch of my computer is enabling these 2 different builds. So there's going to have the service work build and the atomics build. And then when that's available, which I should be able to get up today, we can then start to test out the atomics part. But what's cool is it's really just like a communication, just a callback, right? So in my code, I can work on the how to marshalling data, how to set functions in different iframes, like that. So that's a lot of the really complicated stuff. And then the communication layer is just like send, receive, message. And then how that works can be in a different area. And so that's kind of the fun part that we're doing right now, is to allow the atomics to work in alongside the service worker way too.
Wow. So then there's a third way that you could enable if it's available in the browser. But again, all of this is seamless, and anybody using Partytown would have no clue what's going on behind the scenes.
Yep. And that's the goal. And really the biggest goal of this is like, you go through any service, you read their docs of like, how do I use Google Tag Manager, things like that. They say, copy the script, paste into the HTML some way. And then everybody's got different solutions, whether it's Vue, React, you're just running Jekyll or just HTML, or there's a million different ways to do it, which is kind of cool in that the analytics companies have like the lowest common denominator of how to add scripts is like paste the script into the HTML somehow, right? And so that was I wanted to make sure that lowest common denominator worked. And so at the core, Partytown is based on just like having a script added to the DOM. Now we have wrappers to that so that React and Vue and all the other ones can have an easier way to implement it. But really, again, the lowest level is just, it's a script tag. It gets put into the DOM somehow. And that's really how the script works. So what's happening under the hood is that really you have a script tag. And traditionally, if you have just script enabled in the DOM, it's going to run. Right? Immediately the script element is seen by the DOM and there's working JavaScript inside of it. Boom, it executes immediately. What Partytown is doing differently is like, it's still the exact same way. You're still supposed to copy and paste your Google Tag Manager code in. The only difference is that you add the type attribute of text/Partytown. And so everything of how you do your analytics should be identical, except adding this attribute to it. And then that attribute actually doesn't allow the browser to execute this stuff on the main thread. So there's two things that happen with the attribute. Don't execute this JavaScript, but then also when the Partytown library does load, it's then also a query selector to allow it to find that text and then throw it over to the web worker to execute.
Mm-hmm. So I think I understand now how Partytown works. There's one piece which is the hack, and I think I know what the hack is. You're passing window over to the service worker, the main threads window.
No, we're marshalling a lot of the data. So like you ready for, here's the big trick. Here's the big hack is that web workers have a unique, really cool ability in them in that they can synchronously have HTTP requests.
Yes, I've seen. Yeah, that was the other piece.
Yeah, so import scripts is the big one. So that's one that's used heavily by like code editors. So like Code Sandbox, Stack Blitz, any sort of code editor is going to be using import scripts on the web worker side, because really web workers performance is less important than the main thread's performance, right? So like you can allow it to be blocking, you can allow it to get the information and then continue. So that's a pretty unique API that web workers have that no one else has. And then the other one is the XHR requests that are synchronous. So exact same thing. XHR requests, you can have it blocking where it's not a callback, it's not asynchronous. It's frowned upon and it's basically deprecated inside the main thread because you're blocking everything, right? Like you don't want to block the UI. You don't want to hang up your web app to wait for a response. And so for good reason, that's deprecated, being removed from the main thread. Don't use synchronous HSR in main thread. And we've known this for decades now, right? Just don't do that. On the web worker, again, it doesn't really matter about if you're waiting. So just like import scripts, it's okay to wait a millisecond or wait however long that is because the web worker is asynchronous. Okay, so that said, the web worker has these unique APIs that pretty much the main thread doesn't. So we can have a blocking thing. Okay, so there's that aspect. So then the other trick basically is that service workers can intercept requests, and service workers can be asynchronous, intercept requests, take its time to do something, and then respond to that request. And so it's those two things combined that allows us to have the web worker have a synchronous HTTP request to a service worker. The service worker can then take its time, go do a post message to the main thread, get all the information it needs to have, take however long it needs to take, millisecond, 10 milliseconds, we don't care. Come back to the service worker and say like, hey, I got that information that you wanted. And then respond to the original HTTP request to the web worker with the information needed. And then according to the web worker code, that was blocking. It was 1, 2. It was immediate. It might have been 10 milliseconds or 1 millisecond, but it was blocking. And so document.get element, get computed style, things like that. That can be entirely blocking how you'd expect that code to work. And so that's the big trick. That's how it's working. And that's the service worker trick. And then the atomics way would be the more correct way to do all of this for basically the same process.
I'm not understanding yet So I want to see what it looks like in code
Sure.
to try to better understand that.
This is our test page that we're using to try to implement all the different DOM APIs that's going to be used, or any access to window, things like that. All the common things that any web app, any analytics is going to be using. And so I'll just go to the document version here, whereas these are all the different common document API calls that you would expect to work. Even things like what's the tag name of head, right? Or body, things like that, or what's the compact mode. So all of the APIs that are blocking, that are being accessed from the web worker, but proving that the synchronous channel is working between the two. So I also want to really stress that we're not implementing the DOM. We're not re-implementing the window. So if you think of something like JS DOM or Domino, like a Node.js projects, right? They implement every single thing about document, you document like an element, how query selectors work. Every little thing is re-implemented in JavaScript to act just like the browser. That's not what this is. Basically, what this is basically a really fancy proxy that says like, hey, something was called. Let's collect up what those getters and setters were, or what the arguments were, and just do the exact same thing on the main thread. And let's run it on the main thread, collect up whatever it returned, and then pass it back to the web worker with the whatever it was information it has. And so because we're not implementing the DOM, because we're just having a proxy for everything, we're able to keep this very, very small. So far, the entire library is about 6 kilobytes, which is really, really important to me because...
Is that gzipped?
Yeah, gzipped. So I think it's like 13, not gzipped. Yeah. And so it's really important to me to keep this small, because if it was a 200 kilobyte library, it kind of defeated the purpose, right? Like,
yeah,
it's, like let's take it off the main thread with a 200 kilobyte library. It's like, oh, we're back to where we were in the beginning. And so there's a lot of minification tricks. If you ever worked with me in the past, you'll know that I'm obsessed with making stuff tiny and small file size. And so there's a lot of JavaScript tricks that I'm doing inside of there, property renaming, things like that to make sure it's small. Once we kind of get it more solidified of how it's going to work, I know we can also shave off it a little bit more, because right now it's still kind of development version, things like that. But yeah, this is some of the tests. I mean, you can even visit the tests let's go to, it's all in production, or run it inside of Partytown builder.io. That's where you can find it right now. The exact same tests. They're deployed to basically Vercel anytime I commit. So you can see them, test them out for yourself, take a look at the network tab of how things are working. And then inside of our GitHub actions of every single commit, all of these tests are being run inside of Playwright, which if you're familiar with Playwright, it's basically Microsoft's Puppeteer, which is a headless Chrome browser. Playwright tests are awesome. It's very similar to something that I created with Stencil, where Stencil, are you familiar with Stencil.js at all?
Is that for web components?
Yes. I worked on the test suite for that, where it's using Jest and Puppeteer to basically do the same thing, where it provides a test suite to access the Puppeteer and be able to test in a real browser, real headless browsers, things like that. What I love about Playwright is like that call comes out of the box. It has its testing suite. It just works. Installing it just works. Installing it inside of CI, setting that up just works. And so a huge fan of it. And not only is it just like Puppeteer, but also it works inside of Safari and Firefox also, which I think is a big win. So I have it, again, every commit, it's testing inside of Chrome and Safari right now to make sure it's doing exactly what you expect it to do. Also wanted to say, like, Cypress is great. I think Cypress's DX is very, very hard to compete with. I mean, it's some of the best testing tools out there. But in this example, we're using service worker, post message, web workers, HTTP requests and response. So all of this is happening in like one call. That's pretty hard to test. And Cypress wasn't able to handle all of those channels going back and forth. So that's why I needed to use, something that's straight up, a headless browser and test it there. And so if that's answers, if you know what's wondering why I used Puppeteer over Cypress, something like that, it's basically that.
So you've mocked some of the DOM, and what you're doing is those fake DOM calls are being made in the actual thread, and then you're sending that fake window object over to the web worker.
Yeah. So if we go to the web worker thread here, I've got this proxy. So this is the bread and butter of the whole system, right? Like basically everything goes through a proxy, which is also to Partytown's benefit, because that means we control everything. So even allowing developers to say like, hey, we don't want anyone accessing document.cookie, right? Because no matter what the system wants to do, like whatever third-party script wants to do, they're in your little sandbox. They're in your world. They're not on your main thread. And they have to go through this proxy object to get to the main thread. And so because of that, you're able to control like, well, I don't want you accessing the document window, or I don't want you, accessing user agent, things like that. I'll always give you some standard user agent. That's the big thing that's happening here, is that we're able to say like any sort of getter. Let's say that I do window, or let's do document.body.client with. right? So client with is a getter.
Document.clientWith. So what happens is the target that you've got in here would be an object that you've created with a .clientWith on it. And then the prop key they're going to have is clientWith. And then it's going to check to see if it exists in here.
Yep. So it's going to basically check to see if we already have that property on the object, which for the most part, you're not going to have it because we didn't stub out much of anything. And then it's going to end up calling this getter. This getter does a few things, and we do a queue task. Let's go to queue task. This is everything that's being called. This is all information. And also you'll kind of notice these dollar signs like that. I'm using that for property renaming. So in debug mode, you're able to understand where everything, it's all, not minified. You can see what it is. But in production mode, that's one character. So that's just to point out, like that's kind of another minification trick that we're using. All right. So information is stranded queue. And by the queue, we're able to all of the setters that happen. So let's say like set attribute, a data set, some value, like if you have a whole bunch of setters that happen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, right? We can do them all in one go. They don't need to all be like back and forth. And so that's why there's this queue system that we're working on to make sure that all the setters can be done once. And that should help out a little bit with like repaints, because on the main thread, you kind of want to apply everything in one go. According to the web worker, it's still synchronous, but the main thread does receive things, 1 millisecond between them. So we don't want to do a whole bunch of repaints as like you set CSS and then you want to set a class name and then you want to set attribute. You kind of want to do it all in one go. So that's why there's a queue that would only work for setters and any sort of getter. So if you do, 10 setters and then you do a getter, it's going to like stop that queue and do them all in one go. Okay, so here we do a synchronous send message.
This is in the queue that's happening, or there's a debounce essentially, or something. You're basically saying that every setter that's happening, you're queuing up that action, and then when a getter occurs, you're running all of the setters at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, basically. And so that's something that we're applying right now. I do think there could probably be some holes in that scenario. There could be a certain scenario where that wouldn't work, but for the most part, like we're adding any checks to make sure that everything gets applied when we think it needs to be applied. And the methods like set attribute, it would be like a special case because like I personally know that set attribute returns undefined and then it's a setter thing. It doesn't actually change code. And so there's going to be a handful of very common APIs like basically set attribute that will say like, this one's okay. But all the other method calls would be like, all right, we don't know what's going to happen with this. Let's make sure we run all the setters and then run that method.
Just to clarify for people, set attribute being on a DOM element, there is a .set attribute, and then when you pass it a string, that is the attribute name on your HTML element, and the second thing you pass in is the value for that.
Yep, exactly. Any property setter, things like that, same thing. It's going to get all queued up. And so here's the big trick is that we've got send sync message. Let's find where that service worker send synchronous message. This is it. This is the big stuff where basically I post the information to this URL and right here is your big trick, false. So if we look at the docs here, that argument async up here, Boolean is false, meaning that we want to, in the main thread and everything in your coding, everything you've done traditionally, basically you're going to be using fetch now. But if you're using XHR request, you're going to be always setting this to true. And you're going to be having it unload or unresponse or something like that. And then you're listening for that. You want to know what the response type is. And then you want to get the status, if it's okay. That's what everyone's familiar with. And even today, you're going to be using fetch. But here, it's 1-2. Notice there's no async. There's no callback. There's no promise. It's immediately, we get the information right here.
And this is a fake post. This is posting to something that we have listening in either another web worker or the client itself.
It's an actual HTTP request, but the service worker is going to immediately intercept that. So it doesn't actually leave the browser. It's not a network call.
Yeah, I'm curious what's making the data call and what's listening for the data call.
So here, that code I just showed was an XHR request for this URL. So if we look at, these are a couple of the requests that are happening. And again, this is tests, and these tests are doing all sorts of scenarios. So there's a handful of them that are happening here, but ideally it doesn't need to be too many requests that are happening. And the other thing you'll notice is that they're all being intercepted by the service worker. You can see that here. So they're not actual HTTP requests to like some server somewhere. It's all staying local to your machine. They're actually local to the web worker. So if we look at one of these requests here, this is the URL that happened. And so because I've got a service worker that says anything underneath the Partytown directory, I want to intercept. And this is another thing is like, it has to fall under a different scope so that it doesn't overwrite your service worker, because your service worker is going to have basically the root scope and is going to intercept anything that you want if you're using service workers. So this isn't messing with yours. It's basically falling under a different directory. And that's why it's under this delete Partytown that we have here. If you recognize, this is the same data that we were setting up before. This is what we sent to the main thread. Like here, we're saying like, I want to run element by ID, and it's a method.
Oh, I see it now.
Yeah.
So you're telling the code what to do through an HTTP request that's synchronous from the web worker to the main thread?
Yes. And the main thread is going to receive this information. It's like, hey, I want to call on this instance, which happens to be document.body, right? So we already have IDs of like its instance, body is, in this case, instance 4, right? So on the body, I want to run this method called get element by ID. And the attributes or the arguments I want to give it is called test anchor, right? And actually, why don't we even, view the page source and see what code that's running here, right here. That's what's being ran, right? So notice that one, I've got text Python here. So when the browser sees that, it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm going to do nothing, right? Whereas if you didn't have it there, it's like, oh, it's a script editor. It's got JavaScript inside. Let's execute this JavaScript. And so that's the first trick, is just like, whatever, let's not do this. This is basically a hidden div and do nothing. And then Partytown is able to query select for these attributes and say like, hey, let's take this code and let's run it over here. And then immediately when you do that, you're going to see like, well, the web workers, you're like, what the heck is a document? I have no idea what you're talking about. And it's going to crash, right? And that's always been the issue. In this case, we created a proxy. So window, basically we've got a proxy on window that when document was called, it's like, oh, I know what that is. I'm a proxy. And then when get element by ID is, it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Let's just collect what the name was and let's send that over to the main thread. Maybe they know what that is. And the main thread's like, oh, document that get element by ID. Of course I know what that is. It runs the code on the main thread, gets the information, and then returns it to element. So in the web worker, this is still the element object is still a proxy. It's not a real element. It's not like this implemented element or anything like that. It's still a proxy itself.
The proxy returns another proxy.
Right.
Okay.
It created another instance of another proxy with an ID. And so on the main thread, we gave it an ID of like, oh, you're ID 5, right? This element's ID 5. And so like all this knows is like, hey, I'm another proxy and my ID is 5. And so then now here we have a setter. I want to assign the test anchor to the setter of class name. And this is, again, the proxy is like, no idea what you're talking about, but I'm a setter. So let's send this information over to the main thread. The main thread's like, oh yeah, let's look up, you want the element of ID 5 and let's have, assign setter class name of text anchor to it. And so that's what's happening there. And all of this process is happening in 1 to 2 milliseconds. And with atomics, it should be even faster. So the code isn't any faster, right? So in the web worker, it's actually going to be slower than what it was on the main thread, but also you can see that as a benefit, right? Because we don't want it running on the main thread to begin with. Mm-hmm. We want to slow down their stuff. We don't want it to do layout thrashing. That's another thing that we can control here is like, if they're doing all sorts of tricks that's just causing your document to repaint, do reflows, relayouts, things like that. We don't want that happening. Like, hey, chill out. Let's put you in a request animation frame. Let's make sure that you're applying your stuff at our pace, which is a good thing. So yes, your code in the web worker is going to run slower, but at the same time, this is asynchronous third-party scripts that basically like Google Tag Manager, where they receive events and then they post events, right? They're not actually your web app, right? They're just kind of asynchronously doing things in the background. So that's why they're perfect for web workers, because we want that stuff to just like asynchronously happen. But the big trick is that this would never have worked traditionally. Mm-hmm. And Google Tag Manager does use document.cookie, does use document.head, append script, things like that. It does do a lot of document things for like lookups, but for the most part, it's just posting like a image tag or a image request for some collecting data. And we want that, 200 kilobytes of code that happens somewhere else and stop messing with our main thread.
So the main thing that I'm confused about right now is I see the script tag. This is in your main document, right?
Yes.
And then something is reading all type text party towns and processing those scripts and then turning it into some kind of HTTP request.
Yeah.
And then is that HTTP request being sent to the web worker or
yes.
not? Okay. That's making sense now. So you wrote this code in your document that is supposed to do something to an anchor tag, and then it's sending that over to the service worker, and the service worker is actually going to execute that code instead of it being executed in your main thread.
Because the service worker actually has access to see who are my clients, as they call it. Like a service worker has clients, which is really the main thread. And so then through the service worker, I'm able to do a post message, which is asynchronous, which is back to the traditional way things have always worked between windows. You use this post message, you go to the main thread. Main thread's like, oh, I know what you're talking about. Let's execute this code, return it to the service worker. service worker takes that data and just forwards it back onto the original request is what's happening there.
Okay. Still a little confused, but I think I understand the process of where the code's moving and how it's going. You're not actually sending the JavaScript itself over. You're sending a set of data over and there's a proxy. Is the proxy in the web worker itself?
The HTTP request and response is in the web worker.
Mm-hmm.
The service worker is the one receiving those requests and responses. And in the service worker is the one that then says like, oh, hey, let's talk to the main thread, get more information, and then respond. There's a lot of hoops there. There's a lot of communication channels. And again, like that's what I was saying, like this process isn't going to make this code run faster. In fact, it's probably going to make it run slower. But we're talking about third-party scripts that is background tasks, that they are meant to be off the main thread. They're meant to asynchronously post updates. Like when the user clicks something, we collect that data and then we post it to some service. We want that happening kind of in the background tasks. And so that's the difference here. It's like, in theory, you probably could make your whole Create React app work with this process, but it's going to be slower. That's not the goal of Partytown at all.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to keep the main thread to your code, run your main thread as fast as possible. And all your third-party scripts that are supposed to be just like background tests, they're the ones that are supposed to be in the web worker.
So let's be clear about this. The main thread is actually going to be faster because it's been freed up to do more stuff, but the third-party scripts are the ones that are actually going to be slower.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this isn't like everything just magically works. I would like to think we could get it to that point where everything would magically work, but there's where something would not work. And that's why this is actually opt-in, right? So like, let's say you've got 3 different analytics services that you're using. 2 of them work well inside of Partytown. The third one, for some reason, doesn't work with it. Then you just don't put this on here and everything just works traditionally. And so it doesn't try to magically find scripts and magically decide like, oh, you should be going into a web worker. It's more like you decide, you choose which scripts should be going inside of the Partytown.
Okay, that makes sense too. I think the thing that I'm missing now is what does this look like for an actual application?
So that's the part that we're heavily testing now. So I probably should be super, super clear. This is alpha. This is highly experimental. Do not run this in production today, right? This is entirely an idea that we had. So I'm working at builder.io, and builder.io is, it allows you to build landing pages, allows you to build all your sites for e-commerce sites, things like that. It's often hooked up to Shopify in the back end. So it does the front end for Shopify, things like that. So you can visit builder.io, see what it's all about. But the big thing that we're noticing is that no matter how fast we can make everything, all of these e-commerce companies are still always hit by the third-party scripts. Their sites are slower, their SEO rankings are going down because they're being penalized by Lighthouse and 4 Web Vitals, things like that. So we can make Builder as fast as possible. And we're working on that with a project called Quick. So Mishko Hebri and I have been working on another framework called Quick, which is basically entirely HTML and CSS and then JavaScript as you need it.
So Quick is a new JavaScript framework that allows you to have state, but it's all in the DOM, it's all in the HTML, and then you don't have any JavaScript like React running that's processing and then creating the HTML itself.
Yeah, it's been a fun project. It's still, again, I won't even label that as alpha at this point. It's a lot of fun to build because we've got a lot of customer sites that we can prove it on, not in production, but we can prove it on like this actually makes your site extremely, extremely fast because it's just HTML and CSS. And when they need JavaScript, we'll already prefetch JavaScript. It'll be sitting there ready for them when they click the button, but it's not required to kick things in. And so something like Next.js, where it's very similar to that, but when React rehydrates, it basically replays it downloads all the JavaScript again. So if you want something to be interactive, it needs the whole application again to kick in and to apply itself. And so perception-wise, Next.js is great, right? So a lot of our sites are Next.js. A lot of sites I've worked on in the past are, you go to it, loads immediately, but you're still getting penalized and your time to interactive is still pretty slow because it still needs to download basically all of React and to kick in all of those listeners, kick in all the event listeners, things like that. How Quick is different is that none of that's actually necessary. Immediately, you can't get faster in HTML and CSS, right? That's the fastest possible. So we got that working. We have a lot of demos, internally of that doing a really good job, but then it's just darn it. Now we got HubSpot, literally 800 kilobytes of HubSpot that Lighthouse hates. And Lighthouse gives us a bad score on because hey, don't have so much JavaScript to main thread. It's well, we'd love to, but we can't do anything about it. So that's where Partytown came into this. That's where all right, so if we can make fast websites, but we're still getting penalized, we need to solve this side of the problem too. And so Quick is still under heavy development and really is kind of solving one half of the problem and something we'll be working on for Builder. And then this is another side of the problem that I'm taking on to try to basically free up, those resources so that our customer sites and this is open source, anyone can start using it or test it out, I guess, right? It's a better way to put it. Basically, dedicate all of the main thread to your code. And so something like quick can be extremely powerful in that Google is like, wow, this page loaded in a millisecond. There's no JavaScript. All the content I want is right there. It's all in just HTML. I can read everything about it really fast. And to the user on their phone in the subway, it's going to load as fast as possible. And it doesn't need to download, 300 megabytes or kilobytes of React code to then allow a button to work, or then to do next page transition to work, things like that. And then any of the megabytes, third-party scripts are running somewhere else. They can take their time. They can run it a little bit slower into a different thread and not affect the user's experience. At least that's the plan. How about?
Yeah.
That's our goal with it. And, again, experimental alpha, don't put it into production today, but that's the direction that we're going with this.
Yeah, I definitely want to play around with this myself. I've actually experimented with putting things into web workers to get things off the main thread. I've never been too successful with it because it's so much trouble to get that back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that you made it synchronous is a really interesting way of doing it. I also want to see more examples. I want to see more ways of how this is used, because I feel like I'm missing something with how I would do this in production. Now, I know it's alpha, but I still want to see if I wanted to use this when it does come out, what am I expected to do?
Let's see here. So let's go to integration, since I think I've got this working right now.
Yeah, this is where I'm looking.
So imagine this is your site, and Google Tag Manager has told you to paste in this code. This is kind of deminified Google Analytics script that everybody has on their site. Like pretty much everyone has this code in their site, but I kind of deminified it so I could read it a little bit better. The big difference is this section, right? This section tells, the browser, like, I have no idea what this is. It's basically just a div with some text inside of it. Don't do anything with it. And then when Partytown kicks in, it's like, hey, let's find all those scripts with this, with type, text/Partytown, and let's throw that text into the web worker and execute it. So basically, this would be the difference that you'd have to do. You'd want to have to, add this to your scripts that you do want to use with Partytown. And then the other one is just adding the snippet, basically. So another couple, just for this test, the tricks that I'm doing is just everything's in line, because I don't want to have other network requests to mess with my test. So this is, you look at this, it's like, this is ugly code, but it is, but it's basically as minimal as possible to not affect the other scores. Okay. And so then the other thing that you're probably going to wonder, like if you're a Google Tag Manager user, is like, I want to send custom events. So like every time someone clicks add to cart or someone does something special, I want to send that data over to Google Tag Manager, to Google Analytics to collect this information. So you would say like, well, that's obviously never going to work, because all that, basically the data layer array, this guy, which you're going to see at basically every single site in the world, isn't sitting in the main thread. And so that's also part of what Partytown is doing, is it actually does patch that. And so I'm doing it here. We have wrappers that make this all easy to use, easy to understand. But internally, we're basically saying like, we need to patch this array immediately. This is all test code. You're not going to have to run any of this stuff. This is, my test page stuff. What this snippet is doing is basically it's applying this array to the window. And then when you as the user are adding stuff to it, it knows how to forward that on to the web worker. So everything is still identical. So the snippet is added, and we're collecting up all the information, just like how data layer array always has worked.
Is this .push thing, data layer .push, is this going into the proxy? And so it's essentially proxying if data layer is called on window, and then there's a .push, go ahead and send that call to the web worker.
Yes, exactly. And so I've got, it looks like my local build has got an error in it. Like, what is that? Yeah. So in classic demo fashion, this guy actually isn't working right now. So I'm trying to think how I can demo this. It's the specific scenario of adding data layer to the window and then forwarding that on.
If we have another one that works, that's fine. We could use it.
Maybe I can just show it in the docs.
This is really cool. I think I'm getting a better view of what's really going on. I noticed that button had an on-click on it too in your example there for the Google Tag Manager.
Yeah, some pretty old school stuff. This is stimulating like add to cart. What you have, for some reason, your site has a reason to push data like this, right? You want to get it into Google Analytics somehow, whatever data it was. That's what this test is doing, is that when you run this code, notice this, there's no Python script here. This is actual, on your window, on the main thread, some UI thing happened, and somewhere in marketing, developer, whatever, somehow you want to push this data. That's just making sure that this works. And so when this happened, which is basically asynchronous, because there's no return value here, we're not expecting any value back from Google Tag Manager and their service. They're basically saying like, hey, send this over. I don't care if it takes a millisecond, if it takes a minute, somehow send it over. It's going to happen immediately. It's going to happen within 5 milliseconds, right? But it's asynchronous is the point. And so that's what's basically showing that this works. Why it's not working on my my machine at the moment, I could tell you, but.
All right, so what's going on here is that the data layer has been proxied through Partytown, and then when you call data layer.push, that's actually going to send the HTTP request synchronously over to the web worker.
It's actually going to be asynchronous from the main thread to the web worker will be asynchronous, which again, data layer.push, that's okay. It's just a serializable data that happens here, big JSON object, post it over to the web worker receives it. And really this is the fun part is that like, we don't have any special code to handle this. It's basically the Google Tag Manager code executed. It ran, it knows what to do at this point. And so that's the big part of like why we want to do proxies and not implement the DOM is that if we have good proxies that's able to just marshal data between the two, the code can just execute as expected. And so we don't have to change anything about Google Tag Manager, which to be honest, it's impossible. There's no way I can go to Google and say like, hey, you should probably start making this asynchronous or something like that, right? There's billions of people using billions of different types of scripts. We can't change that. And so that's the big point is to make sure that those scripts work exactly how they thought that they're supposed to work. Work exactly, they expect document.cookie to work, to be synchronous and to receive a string, things like that. So we need all that to work exactly how it's supposed to. And so when this code basically replays on the worker thread, the Google Tag Manager code on the worker thread is like, already patched it, already knew what to do, already says like, oh, data layer push happened. Let's collect up all the information that you want. Let's add some image requests, send the beacon out to the Google servers and things like that. And so that's the big thing is that we can't alter third-party scripts. They need to work exactly how they think they're supposed to work.
That makes sense. Yeah, the proxy really gives you a lot of power to be able to do that. But then behind the scenes, the fact that you're able to then asynchronously give that over to the web worker makes a lot of sense. When does the synchronous part happen? Is that if the web worker is sending data back to the main thread?
Yeah. So going from web worker to main thread can be synchronous. And that's the part that's always been very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. And that's the part where document.cookie, just, local storage.set, forget, that stuff just couldn't happen in the past. And so, or at least it was hard to do. And so those things can be synchronous. It's going from the main thread to the web worker is where it has to be asynchronous because and we don't want to hang up the main thread. And we could do the other trick the opposite way, but that kind of defeats the purpose. And also the synchronous XHR requests, it shouldn't be happening, right? We don't want that happening in the main thread.
Yeah.
And luckily, because we're not trying to move your web app into Partytown, but rather we're moving third-party scripts, which are kind of all designed to be background type things that are all designed to be asynchronous, send data over to some, or, like SendGrid or what is it, Sentry, like some error happened. Let's post that Sentry code over to, right? That's all kind of just like background code. Like, so that's why it works well for this.
New Relic.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah. I'm seeing so many use cases for this. I can see use cases other than just the third-party scripts, like something you have that needs to do processing in the background and you don't want it to mess with the main thread. But this is really cool to use even for that purpose. Just the third-party scripts would be substantial for e-commerce or blogs or anything that's just displaying data but needs analytics or something running in the background.
Yeah. And so we're testing out on a lot of big sites because if you have just a blog with just Google Analytics, you're not going to see it as big a benefit because that might be the only JavaScript that's running. And Tag Manager will load after, by load, things like that. So you will see a slight benefit there, right? It's the e-commerce sites that have literally megabytes of somebody else's JavaScript taking your resources, especially on like Android low-end devices, things like that, someone in the subway. That is a huge difference to larger sites that have like analytics. And also like, it's easy to say like, well, don't use analytics, but like, that's a big part of their business, collecting that data, understanding what users are doing, things like that. That's necessary code to understand what users is so they can make good business decisions. So I don't think it's fair to say like, well, just don't use third-party scripts. And that's the problem that a lot of our customers have is just like, we need these things, but they're also affecting our SEO ranks. So if we can increase our SEO, we'll increase our users, increase our dollars, things like that. So that's what we're trying to test on right now is to pretty much test it on larger sites that do have a lot of users and do have a lot of scripts. And so I'm working with a few internally right now to try to enable this. There's still a lot of work to be done there to try to prove it out. This could fail miserably and end up not being a good idea. But if it works out well, then it works out well. So like we're trying to going down that path right now. I know my first blog post, talked about the idea, how it's going to work. But really I wanted to be clear that it's alpha, highly experimental, and we don't have any numbers right now. We just know that like you should be running stuff in your main thread. That's always the warnings you get inside of Lighthouse. It's just like you're running all this unused code. No, don't do that, right? So like we have all this data to say like this is what we should be doing. So now we just gotta prove it that it's making a difference. And we even presented this to the Chrome team. They've been extremely helpful, providing us feedback. I wanted to make sure that like we're seeing better numbers with it. we're seeing, Lighthouse doesn't even see basically Partytown happening at all. And because of that, I was worried like, well, will the Chrome team think that we're gaming the system and just trying to trick Lighthouse and they'll fix that bug. But no, they see this as actually, this is doing the correct thing. Lighthouse is reporting the correct numbers. Like we don't want stuff in the main thread. So you got their blessing, I feel. And so we're going to keep working on it in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that they have this restriction that you shouldn't do that. But even the tooling that Google also makes for Google Analytics is causing problems with Lighthouse.
Yeah, it's funny how like that's when you get that recommendation from Google to say that you stop using this Google product. But again, tell your marketers that you're not going to have Google Analytics on your site anymore.
Yeah.
It's not happening.
Yeah, there are many things that cause the main thread to lock up. And the greatest thing that I'm seeing here is that you can just push them off to a service worker and not worry about it. Does the Google Analytics loader code also load in the service worker? Something that tells Google Analytics, hey, I need to go to this URL and then pull this JavaScript file and run it.
Yep. So that's a big part of the project too, is like really that script that I was showing earlier of the Google Analytics script or Google Tag Manager. What it's doing is it creates its own script. It creates its own URL, then it appends it to the head, right? And that's the real guts, right? So like my little script that did run really wasn't that big a savings. It was the next thing that runs, and then the next thing that runs, that's the big savings. So that's, again, the whole part of the proxy system is that when document.create element came through our proxy and it created a script, and that's where like, oh, this is a big deal. We don't want to actually create the script in the main thread. That's where the proxy is like, that's like the one special case, which is like, nope. You're going to say inside of the web worker, and we're going to run you with import scripts, which allows it to apply to the global of the web worker, no different than how it would apply to the global of the window. And so that, again, that's the special use case where the proxy is in our favor, that it allows it to not actually happen on the main thread. And the code execute exactly how it's supposed to. Like, so it sees all the documents, it sees the window objects and things like that. And there's really no special code there to allow the Google Analytics to work as expected.
Yeah. I like the idea of using a proxy. It's the right way to do it instead of just mocking things where you can. You are mocking things where you can, but it's still proxied regardless. And what you're doing is just having a little object that you're passing to it with some configuration values to tell it, okay, there are some extra things that you need to proxy here. These are what they're called. And then once those happen, you've got them. And then I'm assuming in the future, you'll have some kind of built-in templates for all of these third-party scripts to allow it to be easier to do those things.
Yep. And so internally in the project, I've got just Google Tag Manager as like a helper function, because I kind of see that as like everybody has that. But the tools, basically the helper functions used to create that would be exposed so that any third-party analytics company would be able to extend that and do the same thing and provide their own. Because I personally don't want to get in the business of trying to maintain hundreds of components for hundreds of different companies. That's just not going to happen. So it provided the tools to do the same thing, because it's really not that difficult. That it's really just your same snippet that you had before, but having a text or a type attribute added to it. It's the big difference. And then the other one would be like making sure that we can do like facades. And by facade, I mean like the intercom project, like the little chat bubble that pops up. It's got a blue circle in the bottom right of corner, and you click that. It's like, hey, how can we help you? Right.
Yeah. That's the other one that takes up a lot of space and time.
Yes. And so we wanted to also make sure that we have a good way to do facades too, where like you could provide that blue circle and everything, but it's actually just the blue circle. And when you click it is when it kicks in the actual code. And so there might be two paths that we have Partytown working, where it's like one where it's like it just provides the UI facades, but then makes it easy for you to provide a utility that then kicks in your actual code. And then the other one is working inside of web workers. That's the area that we're experimenting with right now. Is like, where's the best balance of the two, providing a facade versus running it in the web worker.
What does facade mean?
So do you see this little guy right down here?
Yeah.
That blue icon? The way that actually happened was that in the main thread, we told Intercom to load. Intercom downloaded like 800 kilobytes of code. That code then added a whole bunch of CSS to this document. And then it added an event list here that said like, hey, when I load, let's now animate in this little blue icon, right? So it took a lot of code to just make this little icon show up, which a majority of people might not ever click.
Yeah.
Right. It's just this thing. So like, that's a huge hit to any page and drain of resources just for that icon. Right. And so the facade idea is basically this, provide the same icon that is really kind of more of just divs and CSS. So it's really going to be like 200 bytes of code to make the same thing happen, to make the same little thing animate in, but it didn't actually download all of the HubSpot 800 kilobytes of HubSpot code to make this happen. But then when I do click it, this would kick in exactly how HubSpot would want to see it kick in,
Okay.
using the traditional way of how the code would work. So that's the idea of facade.
So facade would be something that puts the DOM in there in the way that it was expected to render somehow without actually having to download all the code required to get that thing to load in.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the big recommendations that the Chrome team has, and a lot of their resources talk about you should build facades. So like if you have YouTube widgets, like a whole bunch of YouTube widgets on your homepage, that's going to drain a lot. So like instead have like a fake image of YouTube. And when they click play, then they bring in the real one at the moment they click play.
I think I know what you're talking about now. Yeah, this is something that you'll also see from Facebook where they changed the React app to use suspense, and before it's actually rendered all of the content, you get this facade as in a silhouette of what would be loaded should the page have actually loaded, and then it will put in what's there. So that's what you mean by facade, is a silhouette essentially of the actual DOM component prior to it coming in.
And like in this case, you might never click that blue circle, right? Like there might be a good percentage of people never clicking it. So like to have everybody download this megabytes of code for a blue circle they might not ever click is pretty wasteful. And so that's the whole idea. But instead, for the people that do click it, they're the ones would then because they want it, it would then kick it in.
Yeah, and I like the fact that it turns on only for the people that actually need it. Then it would, in the service worker, it would download the 800 kilobytes, and then you would have access to it.
Yeah, and so that's the other half of this project that we're trying to find a balance of maybe UI things. Like not everything there's the silver bullet for every solution. But like in the case of this solution, where intercom in most cases is going to be used, and it's just going to be showing that UI. Maybe that's a facade type of solution, right? That's where we have this blue circle div show up. If you click it, then to download the real stuff. And Partytown would provide the utilities to make that easy, right? I mean, that's another thing is like we can all code this today, but it's kind of complicated, takes a lot of time. So we want to provide those utilities to make that easy. And then the other half would be something like Google Tag Manager, where that actually needs to always run, but it's more of an asynchronous run in the background type thing. So like that doesn't have a facade. There is no UI. That's something that probably should be in a web work. And so that's where we're trying to find the balance of how this project should be helping out in different areas.
Is there anything else that you want to add in?
Yeah, the other thing that I'm pretty excited about is because we're going through the proxies, developers also have control of saying like, you should not have access to document cookies, or you should not be inspecting the user agent, things like that. So they would be able to have this sandboxing control. Basically, right now, it's kind of a crazy world that we've got that everybody else's JavaScript is on our window, on our code, inspecting little things, they could be reading all this different information that we don't know what they're doing, right? So when we add it inside of the sandbox, we now have access to that. We can now log out exactly what they are doing. We can have a better idea of what's going on. We can control what they can and cannot read. They're not allowed to have local storage access, things like that. So that's the other side of it that I think is kind of exciting, of being able to control what third-party scripts can and cannot do for your users on your users' devices.
Yeah, so there's a security benefit as well.
Yeah, I hate to say that it's a security benefit because you can't say anything is like secure, but it definitely helps as like isolation and sandboxing.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. This is a really neat technology, and I'm really glad that you've worked on it and you've put something together, because it's something that I've also looked into myself and been unsuccessful trying to do. It's like even trying to understand how you would do something like this with service workers where they need access to the DOM. This is pretty incredible that we're able to get that, even though it's something that essentially proxies it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I know I've said it a couple of times, but alpha, experimental.
Yeah. Don't
run this in production. But we would love to have anyone and everyone help test it out. Ping me on Twitter. We have a Discord channel for this, so I'm getting a lot of help there. So if you have this problem, if you're running on a big site and you have big third-party analytic issues, I'd love to work with you to try to help solve a lot of these problems so that can be, help out everyone.
Thank you very much for coming on the show, Adam.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
That was a great conversation by Adam Bradley, and I really appreciate his time. And if you'd like to see more of these videos, please feel free to comment and subscribe. I would love to get any feedback that you have, and I hope you can also take your code to the next level.